Imagine it. No one asking anything of you. No pings, no meetings, no small talk. Just silence. For a moment, that sounds perfect, doesn't it? We live in a world of relentless noise. Emails before sunrise, notifications at midnight, conversations that never seem to end. Of course, the idea of pure solitude carries a kind of fantasy. Maybe you thought this when the pandemic lockdowns began. Finally, time alone. Time to read, to think, to breathe. But here is what almost no one anticipated, and what science has been warning us about for over a century. Forced isolation does not quiet the mind. It breaks it. Not metaphorically, not poetically, structurally, measurably, often permanently. And the brain does not care whether it is a prison cell, a pandemic apartment, or a hospital room. If the isolation is involuntary, if there is no choice, no endpoint, no belonging, the damage is the same. Dr. Terry Kupers is a psychiatrist and professor emeritus at the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. For over 4 decades, he has worked inside prisons, jails, and solitary confinement units across the United States, examining the mental health of people held in conditions of radical isolation. He is a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He has testified as an expert witness in more than 24 major class action lawsuits on prison conditions, including the landmark Ashker versus Brown case, which ended long-term solitary confinement at California's Pelican Bay State Prison. His work is not theoretical. It is drawn from face-to-face encounters with men and women whose minds were dismantled, cell by cell, day by day, in the dark. He has also authored the TED-Ed animated lesson that inspired this video, titled, "What Happens to Your Brain Without Any Social Contact?" And what he found is both scientifically precise and deeply, urgently human. Before we talk about what isolation does to the brain, we need to understand what the brain fundamentally is. The human brain is not a logic processor that happens to enjoy company. It is a social organ, shaped across hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, specifically to navigate, interpret, and depend on other people. Think about what your brain does every day in normal life. It reads faces, it predicts intentions, it interprets tone of voice, it holds mental models of other people, what they believe, what they want, what they might do next. It regulates your own emotions partly through social feedback, the nod of understanding, the laugh that confirms a joke landed, the presence of someone nearby. Other humans are not just pleasant extras in your cognitive life. They are essential data inputs that your brain's architecture was built to require. The neuroscientist John Cacioppo spent his career studying loneliness and social isolation. He found that prolonged loneliness triggers the same biological stress responses as physical pain and predatory threat. The brain and body treat social disconnection as a survival emergency. This is not sentiment. This is biology. When you remove social contact from a human brain, you are not giving it peace. You are removing the primary input it was designed to run on. Here is the first and most important distinction in all of this research, and one that Kupers emphasizes consistently. Voluntary solitude is not the same as imposed isolation. They produce completely different neurological outcomes. Choosing to spend a quiet weekend alone, to meditate in silence, to take a solo retreat. These experiences involve agency. The brain holds the knowledge that this is temporary, chosen, and reversible. The door is unlocked. The ending is known. Involuntary isolation, the kind experienced in solitary confinement, long-term illness, estrangement, or forced quarantine without connection, removes all of those protections. There is no known end point. There is no choice. And there is often no clarity about when or whether it will end. That indefiniteness is neurologically catastrophic. The brain's threat detection systems cannot habituate to a danger it cannot predict or control. It stays in a state of chronic activation, flooding the body with cortisol, sharpening anxiety, and eventually exhausting itself. Isolation's effects do not arrive all at once. They layer in, each phase building on the last. In the early days and weeks of involuntary isolation, the first symptoms are often what you might expect: heightened anxiety, difficulty sleeping, restlessness. The mind, deprived of its usual social inputs, begins to generate its own stimulation. Thoughts loop. Old memories surface without invitation. Grievances replay. Minor irritations amplify. The sense of time distorts. Hours feel like days, and the boundary between waking and sleeping blurs. People in solitary confinement report hearing sounds that aren't there, seeing movement at the edges of vision. These are not signs of pre-existing illness. These are the brain, designed for social input, beginning to manufacture it. One of the most significant and least discussed effects of isolation is the collapse of emotional regulation. In normal social life, our emotions are partially regulated externally. A friend's calm voice lowers your heart rate. Eye contact signals safety. Being held, or simply sitting with another person, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's rest and recovery mode. Take all of that away, and the nervous system is left to regulate itself. And the human nervous system is not designed to do this alone, indefinitely. Kupers describes watching previously stable individuals unravel emotionally in isolation. Rage becomes uncontrollable. Weeping comes without clear cause. Mood swings cycle faster and faster. The person cannot explain it. They are not being dramatic. Their nervous system has lost its external stabilizers. The isolation doesn't just make people sad. It makes them emotionally dysregulated in ways that look, from the outside, like dangerous instability, and are then used to justify further isolation. This is one of the cruelest feedback loops Kupers documents. A person becomes emotionally unstable due to isolation. That instability is classified as a behavioral problem, and the response is more isolation. The cause and the punishment become indistinguishable. As isolation extends, particularly in the presence of darkness, idleness, and sensory deprivation, more severe symptoms emerge. Paranoia, the belief that guards are plotting against you, that other inmates are conspiring, that the food is poisoned, that your family has abandoned you by choice, that you are being watched, targeted, erased. This is not irrational character weakness. This is the brain, without social feedback to reality test its own interpretations, spiraling inward. In normal life, other people correct our thinking passively all the time, through reactions, disagreements, and simple presence. In isolation, there is no correction. Every fear confirms itself. Kupers has documented cases in which individuals who entered solitary confinement with no psychiatric history developed full paranoid psychosis within months. Not weeks, months. The U.S. Supreme Court noted as early as 1890 that prisoners in isolation fell into what they called a semi-fatuous condition, a state of such profound mental deterioration that recovery seemed impossible. Others became violently insane. Others committed suicide. That was over 130 years ago. The evidence has only accumulated since. For those who carry histories of trauma, and a disproportionate number of incarcerated people do, isolation does not produce merely new symptoms. It reactivates old wounds with devastating precision. Kupers describes a woman he encountered who had recently been released from a secure housing unit. She was acutely anxious, dissociating, reliving experiences she couldn't name at first. As they spoke, it emerged that as a child, Her mother had locked her in a dark closet, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, as punishment. The solitary confinement cell had not reminded her of that closet in some vague, emotional way. It had triggered full flashbacks, the body reliving the original abuse as if it were happening again, in real time. Isolation does not know the difference between past and present. Trauma stored in the nervous system does not care what year it is. Put a human being in conditions similar enough to their original wound, and the nervous system will respond as if the wound is fresh. For survivors of childhood abuse, solitary confinement is not punishment. It is reactivation. Let's go one level deeper into the neuroscience. Under prolonged isolation and stress, cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, is released continuously. In short bursts, cortisol is adaptive. It sharpens attention, mobilizes energy, primes the immune system. But chronic cortisol exposure is destructive. It damages the hippocampus, the region critical for memory formation and contextualizing experience. Isolated individuals struggle to form new memories, to sequence events in time, to hold on to the thread of a thought. It suppresses activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, emotional regulation, empathy, and impulse control. This is why isolated individuals become impulsive, explosive, unable to think ahead. And it chronically activates the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, locking it into a perpetual alarm state. Everything becomes a potential threat. Every sound, every movement, every interaction. This is not metaphorical deterioration. These are measurable structural changes in brain function. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett and others have documented that chronic social isolation alters the brain's predictive processing systems, how it anticipates and interprets incoming information. Once that architecture is disrupted, ordinary social re-entry becomes neurologically difficult. The brain that was deprived of social input becomes hyper-reactive to it. Kupers and others, who have documented the experience of solitary confinement, note one symptom that is rarely discussed, but is deeply unsettling: the collapse of the sense of time. The human brain tracks time partly through social rhythms, meal conversations, sunrise greetings, the rhythm of work and rest shared with others. It also tracks time through variation in light. In isolation, especially in artificially lit or darkened cells, both of these anchors vanish. Individuals report losing track of what day it is, what month, sometimes what year. In the absence of a social world to locate you within time, the self begins to lose its temporal coordinates. You know you exist, but you no longer know when you exist. And that disorientation is profoundly destabilizing to identity itself. The self is not just located in space, it is located in time, and time, for human beings, is fundamentally social. You might wonder how relevant this is outside the prison context. The answer: deeply relevant. But first, the scale of the prison context itself. The United States incarcerates more people than any other nation on Earth. Within that system, tens of thousands of people. Estimates range widely, but advocacy groups place the number between 40,000 and 80,000 at any given time, are held in some form of solitary confinement. These are not all violent offenders, isolated for clear and immediate safety reasons. Many are people with mental illness, people who violated minor rules, people whose paperwork was lost in bureaucratic systems, people who were placed in solitary as teenagers and remain there decades later. Kupers has testified in conditions he described as the worst he had witnessed in 40 years of forensic psychiatry, places he characterized, without hesitation, as meeting the international definition of torture under United Nations standards. In 2015, the United Nations updated its standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. now known as the Nelson Mandela Rules, specifically to address solitary confinement. The rules define prolonged solitary confinement, more than 15 consecutive days, as cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. They prohibit indefinite solitary confinement entirely. They restrict its use with people with mental illness, juveniles, and pregnant women. These are not fringe positions. These are international standards agreed upon by member states across the globe. The United States has not eliminated the practice. But this conversation does not live only behind prison walls. The pandemic years gave many people their first personal encounter with what involuntary isolation feels like. And the mental health data from that period reflects what neuroscience predicted: surging rates of anxiety, depression, paranoia, sleep disorders, and cognitive fog. Elderly people in care facilities who are socially isolated show accelerated cognitive decline. Solitary confinement of nursing home residents during health crises produced outcomes that shocked caregivers, even among people who had been mentally stable. Children placed in isolation, in schools, juvenile facilities, or chaotic home environments, show measurably stunted development of the prefrontal cortex, the region we need most to manage our own behavior and build relationships with others. Social isolation is not a prison problem. It is a human problem. And our society produces it in many forms. Geographic isolation in rural poverty, social isolation in digital-only existence, emotional isolation within crowded households where no real communication occurs. The most urgent question is the most hopeful one. Can the brain recover from prolonged isolation? The answer is yes, in many cases. But the recovery is not automatic, and it is rarely complete without support. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize and build new pathways, means that restoration of social contact can begin to reverse some of the structural damage. The hippocampus, damaged by chronic cortisol exposure, can regenerate cells with appropriate stimulation, rest, and support. Emotional regulation, eroded by isolation, can be rebuilt through consistent, safe social interaction. But Kupers is clear. Recovery requires more than simply opening the cell door or ending the isolation period. A brain that has been isolated for months or years does not smoothly re-enter social life. It is often hyperreactive, paranoid, and overwhelmed by the very stimulation it was craving. Reintegration requires a structured, gradual increase in social contact. It requires mental health support, both during and after isolation. It requires the social environment outside to be genuinely welcoming and safe, which for people leaving prison, it often is not. Kupers does not simply document the damage. He proposes alternatives, and the evidence supports them. Kupers does not simply document the damage. He proposes alternatives, and the evidence supports them. In states like North Dakota, prison systems have adopted models rooted in rehabilitation rather than punishment through isolation. Staff are trained to de-escalate rather than suppress. Mental health professionals are embedded in facilities. Conflict resolution happens through dialogue, not confinement. The results? Safer facilities, lower rates of violence, better outcomes for people when they leave, lower recidivism. Maine, New York, and Illinois have passed legislation to significantly limit the use of solitary confinement. The movement is growing, not primarily because of sentimentality, but because the evidence is now overwhelming. Isolation does not make prisons safer. It makes people more damaged and releases them back into society in that damaged state. Kupers puts it plainly. What we do to people inside those walls does not stay inside those walls. It walks out with them. We began this video with a fantasy, the appeal of silence, of solitude, of finally being left alone. That fantasy is not wrong. voluntary rest, chosen quiet, deliberate solitude. These are restorative. They are part of a full human life. But the research of Terry Kupers and of the decades of neuroscientists, psychologists, and psychiatrists who preceded and surrounded him points to something we cannot afford to miss. Connection is not a reward the brain enjoys. It is a biological requirement the brain cannot function without. Isolation does not reveal who we are beneath the social noise. It dismantles who we are. The self, our memories, our emotional regulation, our sense of time, our capacity for trust, our ability to think clearly, is not an individual achievement. It is a social construction, maintained moment by our contact with other human beings. Take that contact away, and you do not find the pure self underneath. You find the brain breaking down because the conditions it needs to be itself have been removed. Charles Dickens visited the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia in 1842, one of the first modern solitary confinement institutions. He wrote that what he witnessed was worse than any torture of the body. He could not have known the neuroscience. He knew it from watching human faces. 180 years later, the neuroscience confirms what he saw. Terry Kupers has spent his career making sure that what happens in those cells is witnessed, documented, and testified to in courts of law. He has done this not as an abstraction, but through the faces of real people. People who went in as fully functioning human beings and came out shattered, or did not come out at all. The question this research ultimately asks is not a scientific one. It is a moral one. If we know, with the precision of brain imaging and decades of psychiatric documentation, that prolonged involuntary isolation causes the same deterioration in a human brain as a physical assault on the brain itself, if we know that it does not rehabilitate, does not reduce violence, does not serve any purpose that a less destructive alternative could not serve better, then we are left with only one honest question. Why are we still doing it? This video was inspired by the TED Ed lesson, What Happens to Your Brain Without Any Social Contact? Written by Dr. Terry Kupers, directed by Camille Bovey, and narrated by Addison Anderson. Terry Kupers is the author of Solitary, the inside story of supermax isolation and how we can abolish it. If this video moved you, in either direction, we encourage you to read the first-hand accounts of people who have experienced solitary confinement. They are not statistics. They are people, and their words are more powerful than any animation. Links to further reading, the UN Mandela Rules, prison reform organizations, and Dr. Kupers' own work are available in the description below. If you or someone you know is struggling with isolation, loneliness, or disconnection, regardless of the reason, please reach out to a mental health professional or a trusted person in your life. Connection is not weakness. It is what your brain was built for.